Hi, my name's Mark. I am a first-year SLIS student, and I will be moderating this panel of presentations. Up first, we have Bridget Kelleher, and she is a registered nurse who's currently completing her master's in nursing this semester. She's interested in advocacy and public health work for vulnerable populations, and has most recently worked on innovative projects to deliver care to complex care patients. Bridget will have 20 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next presentation, and at the end of all three, we'll take questions. Start whenever you're ready.
I guess I'll use the microphone because I'm a little nervous. So, my name is Bridget. I am your interloper today. So I am at the School of Nursing. So thank you guys for having me today. So what I'm going to talk about is a project I work on. I work with diabetic patients, and how do we provide innovative care to them sort of outside of the traditional clinic walls. So first, there's not a lot of us, so we don't have to be so informal. But just a show of hands, how many of you have ever been to a doctor or a nurse practitioner for either an annual checkup or if you've ever had an illness? Show of hands. Yeah? How many of you have ever had to wait for your provider? Made to wait in the waiting room. Okay, awesome. And you don't have to raise your hands for this one, but how many of you have ever had your provider ask you to take a new medication or change your behavior? Yeah? All of us. So imagine that frustration or that difficulty that you might have had in that encounter with your provider, and imagine you're one of the 29.1 Americans who have diabetes. And under current clinical guidelines, you're required to see your provider every 3 months and wait for them in the waiting room, and then go see them and have them tell you that you need to change 3 of your 15 medications. Oh, and by the way, you're not eating right, bad you, see you later, all in 15 minutes. You can imagine that's very frustrating, not only for the patients, but for the providers. So what I'm going to talk about today are shared medical appointments, and or SMAs, are all about the lingo you guys were mentioning earlier. So SMAs are a way to break the model of the traditional one-to-one visit and create an interaction for patients and providers that is mutually beneficial. So what is an SMA? What are the ingredients that go into a shared medical appointment? So the first ingredient you need is time. So typically about 90 minutes. So they're much longer than a traditional 15, 20-minute visit. Second is you need a team of providers. Providers who are not only willing to meet outside of the normal 9 to 5 clinic time, but who are also willing to provide care in a way that's different than what they're normally used to. Third, you'll need patients. Ideally, 10 to 12 patients who share a chronic condition. For me, it was diabetics, but there's also different groups around pregnancy, asthma, or heart failure. Whatever you want, you could probably make a group out of it. Fourth, you need food. We had dinner at my medical appointments, and I talked to other people who did groups and they didn't have food, and no one came. So food is important. And the fifth ingredient you need is humility and a willingness to learn. It is important that both the provider and the patient come to the table with these. So before I get into my actual research, I want to walk you through how we structured our SMAs to give you an idea of how they sort of work. So as you can see here, we had an interdisciplinary huddle meeting at 4:30 to about 5:15 p.m. Now, I'm a registered nurse by practice, but in my work with the shared medical appointments, I was just a researcher. I did pinch it occasionally, but not on a regular basis. So our interdisciplinary huddle was made up of a medical assistant, a pharmacist, a registered dietitian, a resident, and then a precepting MD. So they met and highlighted any issues with patients that might be coming up, or talked about the agenda. Then at around 5:30, the patient arrives, and at 5:30, the patients actually move through these 3 sections. So they'll come in, they get their vitals and labs done by the medical assistant. who then puts them in a room where they do have a one-to-one visit with their physician, really quick, 15 minutes. Then maybe if they need a medicine adjustment, the pharmacist will come in and meet with them and do that. And then out in the waiting room, either warming people up or welcoming them back after they had their visit, is our registered dietitian, who answers questions, who does goal setting, and who will actually check in on the progress of their goals. So then for the actual group, it's a whole hour. So the first half, 30 minutes, is all quality content. And then we do an hour of education, storytelling, and goal setting. And then afterwards, at around 7:30, the patients go home and the team comes back together and does a QI debrief, what went well, what didn't go well. We quickly go over surveys. I do surveys all the time with the patients, so we're all about research. Okay. So now I'm going to tell you about what we actually did. So the shared medical appointments I did were at the Cambridge Health Alliance Hospital in Cambridge. It was in their primary care center. Now the primary care center has 3 provider teams, yellow team, blue team, and red team. And each team had their own shared medical appointment. And each shared medical appointment met every 6 weeks. So there were 3 groups meeting every 6 weeks. Each group had patients who were adults. They were all adults, English-speaking diabetics who were referred to the primary care provider. Most of them were type 2 diabetics, but we did have a few type 1s. And there were 2 researchers, there was myself and another woman, and we did a mixed method pilot study to evaluate how well the SMAs could help patients. So we did interviews, satisfaction, and activation surveys, and we looked at diabetes indicators. So LDL, blood pressure, and hemoglobin A1C. So here are our demographics. You can read them pretty clearly. It's about half male, half female, with an average age of 61. So we averaged about 8 patients per group, which was pretty good. And patients came to about 3 visits on average, but some people came to more. So here's the things that you guys really care about, our findings. So for our interviews, I interviewed three patients, 1 from each team, where it was a convenient sample. And these are the main things we came up with: peer support and mentorship, activated patients, and access to integrative care. And I could share with all the wonderful quotes that I got from them, but I'm just going to tell you a story instead, because I feel like that's a little bit better. So this is Jane. So when Jane first joined our shared medical appointment, she was recruited by her primary care provider. And shortly after joining, the pharmacist met with her and said, "Jane, I think you need to start insulin. You've been diabetic for 12 years and your oral agents just aren't working." Jane was very scared. She said she felt like she had failed, that she was not in control of her diabetes, and that she was a failure. And she expressed this fear at the shared medical appointments through our storytelling. And she said that through working with us, with the SMAs, she was able to talk to other insulin users, those who were really well controlled and those who were doing it 12 times a day. And she was able to see, I don't want to be like that 12 times a day person. I want to be like the person next to me who's doing it twice a day. I want to be in control of my diabetes. I don't want my diabetes to control me. So she became this really activated patient. And so because she then was really activated, she was able to meet with the pharmacist during these meetings, change her insulin, and now she's doing much better. She's sleeping better at night, and she's really excited about her life. And she feels like she owns her disease. So that's one, and that's a very similar story that I got from the people I interviewed and from the stories that they share at the shared medical appointments. And like Jane, on our surveys, satisfaction surveys, the participants rated care as a 9 out of 10. So they saw it as pretty much equal or even better than the care that they got from their one-to-one visits. Okay. Yeah, okay. So for the actual diabetes indicator, so the LDL, we decided to throw that data out because It is only measured once a year at the setting that I'm at, and it wasn't a really good indicator because some people got measured at the very beginning of the shared medical appointment, some people got measured 7 months ahead of time, so we couldn't really see a change. The blood pressure, they have actually really good control by the clinical guidelines, so everyone was pretty much on goal for blood pressure, so we decided to not look at that much. But the big thing is diabetes indicators. So I don't know if you're familiar with the term hemoglobin A1C, but it's this really magical lab test that they actually take the average of all your blood sugars over the last 3 months, and they put it all together and they give you one number. And it's a really good indicator for how well your diabetes is controlled. So when we looked at their hemoglobin A1C when they first started, and when they ended their time with us, the shared medical appointments, we found that those who came to 2 or more visits, group visits, decreased their hemoglobin A1C by 0.5 points. Now, you're not medical people, so I'm sure you don't really know, like, oh, what does that mean? Is that a lot? Is that a little? To give you sort of a reference idea, when someone is started on insulin, which we all know what insulin is, so insulin can decrease your hemoglobin A1C by 1 or 2 points. So this can decrease it by 0.5 with no extra medication. So that's pretty, yeah, I know, heads, yeah. So there's a little asterisk here because this is not statistically significant. We didn't have a very large sample size, so we couldn't really do a p-value test that was of value. But for our patients at this time, they were on average able to decrease it. And I have a nifty graph. This is my favorite graph. It's very busy, but I can explain it. Okay, so what we actually did is we compared people who were who came to the SMAs and who didn't come. So on the left-hand side, these are people who were invited and never came. Okay, and then all the way over here are people who came the most times, who could come to maximum 6 visits, and everyone in between. So 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so left to right, more visits, right? Good. These are number of people, so individuals. So this bar chart up here, green is good, red is bad. So this shows your A1C. So the people who were invited and never came, they increased their A1C a lot, actually. So people who didn't do the intervention, right? And then we go along and we see, hey, there's a lot more greens going on. A lot more people are changing their A1Cs. And then we sort of plateau, like, oh, okay, not so much as big a change, maybe a little increase, but not as severe as down here. And so I think this is a really great graph that shows that the more visits you came to, the better effect, better effect you had to your health. There might have been a sort of a tipping point where it was good or bad, and we're looking at that now. So, but overall, yay, SMAs. Okay, so in conclusion, this is a really nice table I put together that sort of compares the traditional one-to-one and the shared medical appointments, and how the shared medical appointments really turns the traditional one-to-one, takes it and puts it on its head. It strips away the hierarchy of the typical provider-patient relationship and places them at the same table, literally. Providers and patients eat together at the same table and learn together. And if patients want to change the agenda of the SMA, so let's say the resident said, hey guys, today we're going to talk about carb counting. And then while we're talking about it, people want to talk about how difficult it is to afford healthy food. We have to change the agenda to meet what they want to talk about. And that's okay. And we have to give up that power as providers, which some providers have had difficulty with, but is very powerful for our patients to help them find their power in their health. And our patients benefit from having the mentorship of their peers who understand where they are coming from with the expertise of a whole medical team there. And providers are able to not only better understand the needs of their patients, about how best to provide education and resources to them. So this is just one way that we can provide innovative care to our patients who are dealing with chronic disease. So thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really cool. Our next presenter is Nicole Sibley, and she is a second semester MS student at Simmons School of Library and Information Science. She's concentrating on information science and technology, and she currently works as the reporting manager for the Amherst College Annual Fund and hopes to take these skills and her graduate school experience into a higher education library environment.
Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about scientific data management, and basically let me give you a summary and then we'll get into some specifics. So during the first half of the presentation, I'm going to kind of discuss a little bit of like lit review style research that I did, and then later I'm going to blend some of that sort of literature review and journal research information with information that I gathered from doing interviews with scientists. So we'll start with talking a little bit about what is scientific data management, so everybody's on the same page. We'll talk a little bit about current scientific data needs, how libraries are really integrating with this, and the opportunities that still exist for libraries to do more. One caveat, focus here is mostly on higher education, with taking some interviews with people from the private sector as well for a little variety, but really think colleges. All right, so what is scientific data management? This quotation I really like because it kind of says it all. Scientific data management concerns the organization of data from its entry to the research cycle through to dissemination and archiving of valuable results. So okay, you start with experimentation in which you generate the data. Then of course there's the processing and storing of that data. So you're talking about like getting the data on the server, tagging it with metadata, hopefully, backing it up, both hopefully in your institutional repository and off-site. Then you kind of get to move on to the exciting part if you're a scientist. Okay, you have all this great data, you know it's existing and it's organized in a way that you can do research with it. So what you're going to do now is do data analysis. And this is the exciting part because it's when you get to prove your hypothesis. So doing all your work, you discovered your thing, and now of course you want to maintain the data for publishing. This is when you synthesize your 1 terabyte of data into the tiny chart that goes into your journal paper, and you take your data and you make sure that it's available for sharing and for long-term archiving. And data management and the data management systems that are being used really follow along with all parts of the research data lifecycle. So before a scientist even gets started kind of creating their data and working with their things, they want to make sure that they have a data management plan in place, which I'll talk a little bit about more later. During, of course, they're going to want to make sure they're doing appropriate data documentation, saving their data in formats that make it really easy to reuse and share and report off of, that they're using appropriate standards, and that they have storage all lined up, which, as we'll see when we get to the interviews, not always so easy. Afterwards, they're going to want to make sure that they're selecting appropriate data for archiving and then archiving that data. Because not all data is actually data that you want to save and use, so you got to throw out the junk, make sure your good stuff is organized. All right, so why does this matter? So current state of scientific data management. There's a couple of things going on. The first thing is pertinent to this quotation that's on the slide, which the long and short of is that in 2011, the National Science Foundation started requiring researchers to submit a 2-page data management plan with any grant proposals. If you work in higher ed and you're a scientist, you're probably going to be applying for an NSF grant. It's really the big place that you go for money, and so this is a big deal, right? The plan needs to have information about, the types of data you're going to be getting during your research, metadata, how you will be making the data available for reuse and how you will be archiving it long term. This is such a prevalent mandate that 95% of librarians are aware that it's the case. And in 79% of the time, the library is where assistance for writing data management plans is coming from. So for people who are working in libraries, especially science libraries, this matters. Of course, the other thing that's going on with science data management is the very big topic of big data. You know, informatics is huge now, data analysis, people are producing more data than ever before, and they need ways to, you know, figure out how they're going to be using this data, and libraries are a natural partnership. So let's talk about that since we're LIS professionals. So data scientists, libraries. So there's a couple of things that have been going on within libraries to position them as places where scientists can come and find really great support for writing data management plans and, you know, doing some data management through the data lifecycle and even figuring out how to do appropriate analysis with data. And the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is the science data interview, which really is what a scientist might be doing at the beginning. Before they're doing research, they're going to want to be prepared, you know, how am I going to use my data? How am I going to write my data management plan? This lets them consider all of these pieces. So the Data Curation Profiles Toolkit from Purdue seems to be a very popular model for the data science interview. Using this model, scientists will do 2 interviews with a librarian that will cover all topics related to the life cycle of research data. So, you know, there'll be discussion, you know, what's your data set going to be like? What's your research life cycle going to be like? How are you planning on sharing the data, promoting access to it? You know, are you going to be transferring data? How are you going to organize it? You know, what metadata are you using? You know, do we need to have interoperability between different systems, you know, where you're going to store your data versus where you're going to put it for short term, for processing, things like that. So that's like one big thing, like, okay, let's figure out what people need, and then we can get them what we need. If we don't ask, we won't know. The other things that libraries are offering are resources for creating data management plans. I have a couple links. I don't think I'm going to go through to them because at the end I'm going to give you a link to my website where I have all this stuff posted in, you know, interest of time. But, you know, libraries are putting up LibGuides and all sorts of resources for scientists for creating data management plans. And I want to give you some examples. So one that I think this link is for one at the University of Massachusetts, my alma mater. They've been doing some research onto really how to support their scientists. They have a nice LibGuide up. Of course, one of the really big ones for data management plans is the DMP tool from the University of California. Yes, they have fancy things. It is fancier than the University of Massachusetts website. And if this is something you're interested in, you should check it out. I actually went in there and pretended that, you know, I was doing astronomy research and filled out a sample form. And the form is great. I mean, it gives you examples. It tells you all the different pieces you need to fulfill and gives you boxes, and then it'll lay out it on a template for you. So, good resources for doing your plans. You can get NSF grants, which of course your institution wants. Another thing that libraries are partnering on are creating workshops for best practices on data management and on data analysis skills. One really great example I read about in a paper was the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which began teaching boot camp style data management and statistics classes to graduate students in 2011. What they were finding is that graduate students were coming into school not with the tools they needed to write data management plans or do the statistical analysis that's really needed for dealing with big data. And so they were, you know, coming to the library, they weren't sure what to do, so the library started providing these sorts of tools. Of course, another thing that's happening is the need for storage. So, you know, people are coming to the library saying, oh, you know, what are metadata standards and policies for sharing? And oh yeah, where can I put my data? And this is actually a problem that I think really isn't being addressed all that robustly yet. Only 24% of universities have a data repository where scientists can, for free, you know, just store all of their data. Oh, you're all set to go, don't worry about it. You know, this is a problem. I talked to a PhD candidate in bioinformatics at the University of Connecticut, and he was saying there's no free place for me to put my data on campus. I, you know, will have a terabyte or more than a terabyte of data when I'm doing my research. I don't have anywhere to put it, anywhere to back it up. I had to get my own server. I have to do all my own IT work. I don't have time to create metadata because I barely have time to do my research because I'm doing something that I wish IT in the library was partnering for and doing with me. So that's a shame, right? He should be doing his research. There's also like all the time, cleaning the data up and then backing it up off site, and oh, the internet's slow and I need to back up all my data, and well, guess what? It takes a couple of days because my internet connection is so slow. So definitely problem with storage solutions. UMass, not much better. They didn't even offer really any space at all. All right, so this, when there's problems, we have the opportunity to really help, and I guess there's a couple of opportunities here, right? So first of all, there's the fact that some of the things scientists need, libraries are positioned really well to do, We should be good at archiving things, and we should be good at connecting people with resources. This is a great way for libraries to stay relevant. I've been seeing, I did a little bit of an inventory of job postings for jobs that are like this, and there's really, a lot of libraries that are actively seeking individuals with science backgrounds to come in and work really closely with scientists. They want people who have research experience or, got their undergraduate degree in a science and can sit down and, do that data interview and be like, oh yeah, I understand how your research works, and I understand the tools you need, and here's what you can get from the library. Of course, the other thing is need for skills for data analysis. There are PhDs that are coming out of programs without a lot of background in statistical analysis, and this is a place where libraries can partner. I actually talked with somebody who works at Dow Chemical. They do a couple of things to help scientists with their statistical needs. And one is, they have everybody go through this Six Sigma program, which has some discussion of statistics and how people can apply it to production. They also do, a lot of work with people in the library. So Dow Chemical has an information services group, which is a fancy way of being like Dow has a library. And the Dow Chemical Information Services group does a lot of really great library functions that scientists in higher ed really want. So you can work with the information services group to create a general data management plan for your research group. And then you can consult with them about customized solutions for what you need for your data. They provide software solutions for big data. And in addition to all of this, they're doing, some of the traditional reference librarian tasks, like making sure that you get access to all of your journal papers. So it's just a really good example of how, libraries in some places are doing more and how we could really be partnering in that way. And then I also have here as an example for the skills for data analysis, and I will click through to this link if we have internet access. This is a really cool class that's being taught by, yes, which is being taught by a librarian in Cambridge at the Harvard-Smithsonian Astrophysical Institute. And it's basically just a class where you can go as a librarian and get data scientist training. And I want to go to this so badly, I wish I lived out here. But it's all learning statistical tools so that you as a librarian can be prepared to say, hey, I can help you work through your data in Python and do statistical analysis, or, we can use SAS, or, whatever you need, or R. And so programs like this are helping keep librarians relevant and very useful to scientists. And let's get rid of that. And then I have some pictures of data science. But let's close. Here's some references for the images, but the one thing I want to show you is I made a website for my 489 class, because you've got to do that. And it's a bunch of links to things that are relevant to this presentation. So got some tools that people are using for data science, have some resources. Look, it's remembering the link we went to. And just things like that. So if you're interested in learning more, here's a resource for you. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. And lastly, we have Kaitlyn Nye. She's an educator and MLIS candidate at Simmons, graduating in May. Her areas of focus include data and information literacy, instruction and assessment, and data management. She serves as membership and outreach chair for the New England chapter of the Association for Information Science and Technology, and she plans a career in academic librarianship.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here to share some of this information about open data and open data mandates with you. And I'm especially pleased, I feel like I need to pay off whoever switched the order of the presentations, because I think it's a great transition from what we just heard from Nicole about research data management to considering, well, what are you going to do with all that beautiful data after you publish something with it? So stay tuned and you'll find out. The information professionals who support scientific researchers have to think about a wide array of threats to the preservation and use of research data, which you heard about from Nicole. Poor metadata, closed standards, obsolescence. But it's rare for them to have to worry about this. Not impossible, but it usually doesn't happen to us in American academic libraries. This experience, a fire in an office building where data was stored in boxes of paper files, happened to one of the scientists I interviewed who does epidemiological research in Africa. Today, you're going to hear more about her methods of data management, her perspectives on openness in epidemiological data, and about the work being done by other epidemiologists who also work across international boundaries. I hope that this will convince you to not worry too much about the fire and to accept that the open data movement presents both opportunities and certain risks for epidemiological research. And that in epidemiology and in every discipline, information professionals need to consider the particular characteristics of that discipline when strategizing how best to move towards our goal of openness. So, you should expect to hear exactly what openness is, how open movements have been making progress in the United States and internationally, what open data means in the particular context of epidemiology, and that will prompt us as information professionals and medical researchers to consider 4 questions. Is biomedical research qualitatively different when it comes to openness from other types of research? Is the way forward for openness top-down mandates or bottom-up sharing? How can infrastructure for responsible sharing of data be created? And how can information professionals here learn from and also support the best practices that are being established by some overseas and international institutions? I expect that this will leave you with just as many questions as it does answers, because this field is still maturing. But that's why we need to jump into it right with both feet. Now, first, openness. Like beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder. To some, it means simply that scholarly information should be available, not hidden behind a paywall. But to the 501, as of earlier this month, signatories, institutional signatories of the Berlin Declaration, openness means not just depositing and publishing a complete version of the work and all its supplemental materials in an appropriate and standard electronic format in a suitable open access repository, but also granting all users a license to copy, use, distribute, transmit, and display the work, and also to make and distribute derivative works for any responsible purpose. Ask a lawyer what responsible is. This first, more limited understanding of open access is gratis open access, and the latter is Libre. But whatever its form, open access can benefit scholars, the scholarly community, as well as individual scholars, and society as a whole, as described in this cheerful image from an open access publisher of journals, books, and data. Now, inspired by the open access movement in scholarly publishing, the open data movement aims to make available not only journal articles, but also the data sets they draw upon, as well as the metadata and protocols necessary to understand, evaluate, and reuse those data sets. Scientists don't just produce open data, they also use it, as this slide suggests. Lisa Palmer of the UMass Medical School has shared an amazing statistic. On a typical day in 2013, scientists downloaded about 30 terabytes from just one repository, the National Center for Biotechnology Information. So at that rate, a year's worth of downloads from NCBI, that makes the equivalent of more than 200 million four-drawer filing cabinets, all filled with text. And they're not just downloading it to download it, they use this data to produce original research, which ideally will itself be shared on open terms, so as to continue this virtuous cycle in which the sharing of knowledge leads to the creation of more knowledge. It's because of this virtuous cycle that can have such positive effects that powerful stakeholders have started to require investigators to share their data. These requirements amount to more than just promising to share data when someone asks for it, a promise that was mostly honored in the breach, even when it was made with every intention of actually following through, because the logistics of managing and preserving data are difficult. No, these requirements, these mandates, they have more teeth, and they're more specific in terms of what data is to be made available. In some cases, actual raw data. The time frame that is given to the investigator, the cost that might be recovered from the users, and the discoverability of this data. The most prominent of these mandates stem from the 2003 sort of foundational memo from the Office of Science and Technology Policy that directed federal agencies to develop plans to support increased public access to the results of research funded by the federal government, just as they're leading us towards the golden age of research data management plans. They're helping us persuade investigators that they need to share their data afterwards. But the institutions mandating open data, they're not limited to governments. Influential funding bodies and journals are also starting to require that data be made available, as are some institutions. Now, these open data mandates, I love them, but they do have cost as well as benefits. And many of them are related to criticisms you may have heard of open access. Some critics point out that managing data is a complex task which requires resources and expertise, for which the creators and stewards of the data deserve some compensation. In particular, some scholarly societies depend on that as their business model. Others contend that freely available and government-funded resources will crowd out the private sector by cannibalizing the market for scientific research data. Finally, some researchers fear that making their data sets available will have negative repercussions for their careers. Hypothetical scientists might fear that other researchers could access her data, analyze it, and publish it first, thus establishing priority. She might fear that other researchers might use her data and protocol but fail to successfully replicate her results, thus casting doubt on her work, which might be good for science as a whole, but is probably not good for the principal investigator of the original study. Others might worry that researchers or even members of the public might find and then misinterpret the data, especially data that is being shared in a raw or less processed form. That particular concern was mentioned repeatedly by researchers I interviewed as the primary reason why they are skeptical of open access mandates, even though in principle they both supported open data as a movement. What's more, data publishing is not yet an expected element in the career progression of scientists. Now, this is not exactly a cost or a risk, but it is sort of the absence of a benefit for early career scientists to invest their energies in open data. At the same time, there are undeniable benefits from open data. It promotes innovation by allowing other researchers to repurpose data that has already been collected and processed. It promotes efficiency by helping researchers target their efforts. It decreases the likelihood of data being rendered unusable by the passage of time and the obsolescence of its physical and logical formats. And it increases transparency by enabling data auditing. These points apply to the open data movement in science generally speaking, in scholarship generally speaking. But when we turn to epidemiology, there are additional points to consider. First, epidemiology, or the study of the incidence, distribution, and control of disease, is unusual among biomedical sciences in that epidemiologists work with huge populations. Although epidemiological data is often collected at a large scale, regional level, national level, some research questions require even larger samples. The open data movement is making it easier for researchers to identify and use existing data sets that include or possibly can be combined to create very large populations. For example, one researcher told me that when she studies less common medical conditions, she has to combine data from her own institution, which has ongoing data collection for more than 5 million people, and other partner institutions in order to create a large enough sample. Second, epidemiologists are highly skilled as a result of their reliance on data collected at this large scale by others, and often their reliance on data collected for purposes unrelated to epidemiological research. This gives them excellent skill at evaluating metadata, working with data dictionaries, and finding ways to repurpose existing data sets. For example, a researcher I interviewed has conducted a long-term research project into chronic obstructive pulmonary disease based largely on data collected originally for medical billing, which is related, obviously, but the medical billing people are not designing their database for your research. Finally, epidemiologists also do longitudinal work that requires data to be collected, updated, and managed over a period of years or even decades. The open data movement and its emphasis on preservation will help epidemiologists find and handle data covering these long time periods. These aspects of epidemiology as a discipline make it a natural fit with research data management and the open data movement. However, there are also some unique challenges for epidemiologists. Any medical researcher working with human subjects, hello, has to consider the legal and ethical implications of personally identifiable health information. Anonymization procedures are always followed, one hopes, but the possibility of de-anonymization or re-identification remains. Even if experienced data managers have tried in good faith to remove all of the personally identifiable information from an epidemiological data set, others who access the data set, they may be able to find novel strategies for de-anonymization, perhaps by combining the epidemiological data set with other sources of information. Famously, Latanya Sweeney at Harvard managed to de-anonymize medical records of Governor Weld, the old governor of Massachusetts, from supposedly anonymized data that had been released by the Massachusetts Group Insurance Commission, just by comparing it with information from the City of Cambridge voter file, which is available to anyone who walks into Cambridge City Hall and has 20 bucks and can read a CD-ROM. In the case of Governor Weld, this data set included diagnoses and prescriptions. For other individuals, that data set might include highly sensitive information This is the case for another epidemiologist I interviewed who studies HIV prophylaxis and treatment. Participants in her research might face severe repercussions if information about their infectious status became public. This risk of de-anonymization may be increased by the growing availability of other open data sets, not just health data sets, but also other types of information that could be analyzed in combination with these seemingly anonymized health data sets. Really, that's the premise and also the promise of data analytics, that you can get insight by analyzing big data in aggregate when you perhaps could not get those insights from analyzing smaller data sets in isolation. Now, because of the risks related to such sensitive health information, epidemiologists must follow laws, policies, and guidelines related to data security and privacy protection very carefully. Everyone involved imposes ethical and also technical standards. And because so many different bodies impose these standards, this duplication can create some problems itself. First of all, keeping track of multiple varying policies associated with different organizations that are participating in a research project, it adds complexity. Second, if policies from two of the collaborating organizations are not just different, that is, one has more rigorous standards than the other, but also conflicting, that is, one requires something that another policy forbids, a round of negotiation between the stakeholders is necessary. This might happen if a funding body strongly supports openness and a regional or national government strongly protects privacy. One principal investigator told me about some complicated negotiations involving her institutional review board at her home institution, the ethics advisory panel at her home institution, the non-governmental organization that was providing the grant, and the government of the country where the research would eventually, after these negotiations, take place. In her experience, they eventually reached a satisfactory accommodation, but it was a drawn-out process. Another researcher who participates in collaborative pharmacoepidemiological projects at the regional and European levels told me that she selects partners to approach for collaboration based on the level of red tape associated with the legal and regulatory framework in potential partners' countries. And she has turned down opportunities to collaborate with certain other scholars, not because she considers their work unreliable, but because she knows that collaborating with researchers from high privacy regulation countries will involve long delays and strict limits on what kind of data might be collected, let alone analyzed and then perhaps published in open data sets. Now, having considered the opportunities and risks associated with open data in epidemiology, we can now consider the 4 questions I raised earlier. First, is epidemiological research or biomedical research a special case to consider separately from other disciplines, one that should be exempted from open data expectations or open data mandates? It's a trick. Every discipline is a special case, depending on the type of data the researchers collect, the scale they work at, the repositories they use, the degree to which they collaborate, the legal framework, copyright, patents, classification in which they operate. Every discipline has unique characteristics that affect how open data can be implemented. A one-size-fits-all approach will just alienate researchers who have concerns, be they valid or invalid, about open data. A more flexible approach that is responsive to discipline-specific factors and that emphasizes the practical benefits that researchers in that discipline can receive will be more successful. Now, that doesn't mean that open data should be considered an option or an add-on, that researchers in epidemiology should be able to say, oh, that's a great idea for those other disciplines, but for us, it just doesn't work. It means that disciplinary experts should be invited to participate in the development of best practices, standards, and social expectations related to open data. Not just the openness advocates and scholarly communication librarians who work on this now. Now, I'd like to invite you to ask me more questions later, because I think now we're going to have our panel discussion. Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you. If I could have Bridget and Nicole back up so we could ask questions, that'd be great. These are all wonderful presentations. And I can just pass the microphone, or you can pass it between you if you'd like.
I have a question actually. So since I'm not in the library world, so wonderful presentations, I have no idea about any of this. But so you were talking about, Nicole, how there are researchers out there who have all this information and they don't have a really good place to store it, and how do you do it? But then how do you, if you don't have a good place to store it, how then you put it onto open access so that people can see your data and do all that stuff?
So you've got to find a good place to put it. So, you know, the person that I talked with at UConn ended up contracting with somebody off campus to store the data, not too convenient. Somebody I knew at MIT didn't use the institutional repository. It didn't have what he needed for, you know, doing his data. They got their own server and saved their stuff on their own server. And then anytime they wanted to get anything off the server, they had to call people from Simmons, which was the company that provided it, and be like, oh, we need to get data off of our server. And as a result, they were storing stuff in Excel files sometimes. Okay, so like that's bad, and that's probably making me super distressed, because there's no way it's going to make it anywhere if it's on an Excel file.
It makes me think of the opportunities.
Yeah, so this is an opportunity, right? So we've got to get the data clean when you're managing it, and I think that probably the NSF requirements to have really good data management plans will hopefully get data a little bit cleaner so that people can share it a little bit better. Yeah.
The standards are definitely evolving for what an acceptable or good data management plan is. In addition to the option of institutional repositories that Nicole was mentioning, it's also important to be aware of disciplinary repositories, which is the solution that most of the epidemiologists I've been working with it makes them feel more comfortable, because they know that their disciplinary priorities are going to be baked in at the bottom of all the policy decisions made at a repository like that. So between institutional and digital and disciplinary repositories, one hopes it will become easier and easier for researchers like yourself to deposit their data somewhere. And that depositing the data into a repository does not necessarily mean that you're promising to make it open. The repository might be the place where you store it without actually making it available. So you can, as a researcher, you can control that in a relatively granular way.
I won't tell you where I store my files.
No, it's like on your PC.
No, we want to
This is actually for you, Bridget. I'm a type 1 diabetic, so I was really excited about your presentation.
Yay, diabetics!
Yeah, I was wondering, you were talking about how A1C levels were generally lower after attending SMAs. Was there a correlation that you saw between those who already had kind of in control A1Cs? You know, like were they more likely to have lower A1Cs after than those who already had higher A1Cs to begin with?
That's a great question, and I didn't say in my talk about this, but all the diabetics who were invited to the SMAs had uncontrolled diabetes. So they had it usually 8 or higher. I think the lowest we had was a 7.6. Yeah, so I mean, we had a woman who was at 13. 13 is really high. That's like, holy expletive, we need to get you to a hospital. She had 13, she went down to, I think 10. She went down to 10.
Wow.
So, and Jane, who I was talking about earlier, she was, she had 11. She was at 11, and she went down to about 9. So she made some really, my Jane person. So yeah, so actually all of them were pretty uncontrolled. But we can talk later.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a little weird.
it seems incredibly successful in terms of what was happening. Is there any thought process of trying to implement this more as opposed to your 5 to 10 minute quick little back and forth with your doctor?
Yeah, so one of the cons of having the SMA, so pros we just talked about in my talk, which are wonderful, let's all get together and love this. But con is that we only have about 10 to 12 people that we see at a time. So it's not that realistic for all of our patients because a lot of providers have panels of over like 200 people. So it would be impossible to have groups running all the time for these patients. And it's best if they have a common thread, so pregnancy, diabetes, heart failure, whatever. But yes, there is sort of a push to sort of implement this for more of our chronic care patients or patients who are having difficulties or multiple medications, for example. But it's about billing. It all comes down to money, which I think you guys really know, and institutional policies if they support it. We're lucky that we can bill it through, we have 2 providers that can bill independently at high levels, but not every institution can do that depending on the providers you have. But yeah, there is a small movement trying to push it more and more, but it requires time. We did it at 5 to 7:30 on Tuesday nights, so you have to have the space, providers who are able to do it, providers who are either salaried or who can bill. So there's a lot of push. But Harvard Vanguard actually here, they do groups for a variety of patients, so I know that they're a big advocate for it.
Does Simmons College have a place for you to put your data and your research papers in?
No, they're all on my home computer.
No, we don't.
I don't think so, I just wonder.
When people come to the library and ask where they should store their data, I direct them to discipline-specific repositories.
That's actually
They have discipline-specific here at Simmons?
No, I'm sorry. Discipline-specific repositories are hosted by societies or by large institutions. So for example, Yale has an enormous social science data repository. Harvard has Dataverse, which is a larger data repository that's more interdisciplinary. But there are also open access journals. So eLife is a new, really successful open access journal, and they are offering data services. Actually, they require that the data, like if you publish a journal in eLife, they require that your data is in an institutional repository or on their repository. So does that answer? Yeah, no, we don't. We have no server space for that, no way.
And from the point of view of the researcher, there may be some real advantages to going to a disciplinary repository, especially one that is very focused on the particular discipline you're working with, because the people there and the documentation they have can give you advice about how it's appropriate to structure your data, that a jack of all trades who is running an institutional repository might not be able to provide in such great depth. So it's not necessarily true that disciplinary repositories are the second string answer when you can't find a place for it at your institution.
And not just with a long-term storage solution in some cases, right?
I mean, it all depends as to whether a disciplinary repository sponsored by a scholarly society, if it's a scholarly society that's not going to disappear in a poof of air, then that should be viable long term.
Well, that's the question about archiving anything that's general.
I had one discussion point or question. In the School of Nursing, they're always trying to get us to do more research and do more research. And they always are trying to pushing us to go to the Nurses' Health Study because it's this very well-known cohort where they have lots and lots of information. But I don't even know how it's stored or organized or managed, and I don't know if you can speak to that at all. Or how, for new researchers who are trying to get into, what would your recommendations be for managing your data, and how do you sort of go into the pool of this open access data if it does become available to them? This is for both of you guys.
For the point of how can a new researcher start managing her data effectively, go to the resources that you saw on Nicole's website, because those are the same ones that come up again and again, and a lot of them are tutorial style. You don't need, everybody needs librarians, let's get that straight. But you can go through the tutorial and get a lot of information without a librarian.
Yeah, there's online classes that you can take that'll give you a really good idea, or even just tools online. You know, like if you go to Purdue's website, or if you go to like MIT's website, or the University of California, and just kind of look at what they're providing for resources for science data management, they're not recreating the wheel, they're linking to all of these other things. And yes, like you said, everybody's kind of linking to the same stuff, and that'll give you a good idea. And I mean, I don't know what Simmons is for. Do you guys have libguides with any standards? So there's stuff here too. I mean, that's something that you might find at like a smaller institution where they'll like say, oh, here's a libguide with some basic overview, and then let us connect you to these wider resources, because those things are free, right? Like I just went in and played around. I don't have any research data. I just wanted to see what was available.
The other thing that I would, I'm sorry, I'm not on the panel. I'm not
Go ahead.
I mean, the other thing that I would really suggest for you specifically that's looking at a subject-specific repository, you know, people have to cite where they're getting their data from. So start paying attention to who's citing the data that comes from this repository, and you know, and if they're doing research that is in your sphere, consider reaching out to them and asking them how they're engaging and how they use the repository. Some repositories do hold training. So for example, edX has a lot of data on their education stuff. You know, if you take an online class through edX, MIT, or any of the other schools, they're all collecting data on you. And there's training held, you know, not super frequently, but I would say every semester there's really good training about how to use, how to extract, how to sign up to get the data, how to extract it, what you can do with it. So that's what I would, those were my two suggestions.
And I think that Annie's point about reach out and touch someone. We're definitely, I don't think we'll ever be at the stage in scientific research where, you know, you just go to a repository and have machine readable data and you don't talk to any people about it. Although we want that to be an option. But the epidemiologists, they get really nervous when you suggest that that might be the future, or when a funder says that's what we want. Especially once when a funder wanted real-time access to raw data. You know, that just, that made the, she picked up the phone and called me when she got that email and said, what are they talking about? So I think especially in the world of health research with personally identifiable information, people will tend to want to know, who are you? What are you going to do with my data? And so reaching out to them is not just a good way to get started, it may be the only way to get started.
It can also get you a job.
Yeah, networking.
Oh God.
I know. Graduation.
Now, I'll also point out that the research data management plan is a requirement if you are going to get an NSF grant. But that doesn't mean you're only allowed to do it if you have an NSF grant. You can, you know, make your own research data management plan using the resources that Nicole was mentioning. And it's a great first step for any kind of work that you're doing.
And I like that you mentioned data dictionaries too. Like, just make a data dictionary no matter what, right?
Yeah. Have a plan. If you have a plan and something goes wrong, you can fix it. But if you have no plan, I mean, it's like you jumped off the boat without wearing a life vest. But you're still near the boat, so we can throw you a life vest and we'll get you back on the boat.
It's just safe on your home piece.
I'll give you my card and we can talk.